What the hell? This clean? Thought black folks were only pure in soul, not in record. Officer Colin Mercer sneered, eyes darting as he miraculously pulled white powder from under the seat. He thought Elijah Turner would panic, just another easy bust to boost his career. But what he didn't know, the dashcam was silently recording every filthy move, every planted bag, every racist whisper, every smug lie, caught in 4K. He didn't catch a criminal. He exposed himself as one. What state are you in? What would you do if this happened to you? Drop a comment, because this story deserves to be heard. The old Ford Crown Victoria pulled up next to the curb by the Lakewood Elementary gate, just as the students poured out like water after a rainstorm. Elijah Turner sat behind the wheel, fingers tapping lightly on the steering wheel, sunlight streaming through the leaves, casting a bright streak on his crisp white shirt. A little girl with a purple backpack ran out of the gate, her face beaming. "Grandpa, sweetheart, ready to go for a ride?" Elijah stepped out, walked around to the passenger seat, and buckled her in. By the time he returned to the driver's seat, the girl was already chattering excitedly about a squirrel that had gotten into the classroom. Just an ordinary afternoon like any other, until a police SUV pulled up, blocking the front of the car. The police car doors swung open and an officer stepped out, wearing a uniform with a badge on his shoulder, one hand resting near his belt. Elijah stayed still, engine running, saying nothing. "Is this your car?" the officer asked. No name, no greeting. Elijah nodded. "Yes. Is there a problem, officer?" The man walked closer, eyes scanning from the license plate to Elijah's face and pausing, as if searching for anything suspicious. "You're not allowed to park here during school dismissal. State police are stepping up patrols." Elijah kept his tone calm. "I just stopped for a few minutes to pick up my granddaughter. She just came out and we were about to leave." The officer said nothing, moved to the passenger side and peeked inside at the little girl, swinging her legs. Elijah turned his head, resting a hand on the window. "But if you need me to go, I'll go now." "License and registration," the officer said curtly. Elijah pulled out his wallet, retrieved 2 cards, and handed them through the window. The officer didn't take them right away, just looked. "What's your occupation?" "I'm retired. Used to work in the justice system." A brief silence followed. The words were soft, but their weight lingered. The officer glanced at Elijah's granddaughter again before turning his eyes back to him. No respect, but no clear hostility either, just a guarded suspicion, shaped by bias. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Elijah turned, his gaze steady, not defiant, not evasive. His eyes didn't rise or fall in tone. They reflected exactly what Mercer had brought with him. "Are you certain I've done something wrong?" Mercer, stitched on the name tag, paused, as if touched by something he hadn't prepared for. His hand still hovered at his belt, but his throat twitched. The question wasn't defiance. It was a test of where the boundary of power lies, and whether it might be pushed too far by nothing more than a look. Finally, Mercer answered, "Step out of the vehicle, sir. I need to conduct a safety check." Elijah didn't argue. "I am a clean and law-abiding citizen." He unbuckled his seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out. No excess motion, no complaint. But inside the car, the little girl had stopped speaking. No one screamed, no one shouted, but something in the air had shifted. An ordinary afternoon was no longer ordinary, and Elijah, standing tall, seemed to know this wasn't the first time he'd been asked to exit his car, just because someone thought he didn't look like he belonged here. Elijah leaned lightly against the car, hands by his sides, not angry, not questioning. Mercer approached from behind, one hand on his belt, the other clicking on a flashlight, bending toward the passenger seat. "I'm going to check the car," he said, not waiting for consent. Elijah said nothing. Inside, the girl clutched her backpack straps, eyes wide. Mercer opened the passenger door, leaned in. The flashlight swept slowly. The car was spotless, orderly, and nothing suspicious. But then his hand moved to his uniform pocket, a fluid, practiced motion, and from it, a clear plastic zip bag with white powder appeared silently in his palm, a pre-planned setup. But he bent quickly, so quickly it looked unconscious, and slipped the bag into the space between the car floor and the seat. Then, like a scene rehearsed dozens of times, Mercer straightened up, feigned shock and yelled, "What the hell is this? Spotless car, huh? I thought black folks like you only had dark skin, not pure souls too. Funny what's under this seat." He held the zip bag up in front of Elijah like he'd just uncovered a major crime. Passers-by began to stop. Whispering started. A woman raised her phone. A teenager adjusted his camera angle from afar. Elijah didn't look at the bag. He looked straight at Mercer. Eyes unchanged since stepping out of the car. No hatred, no pleading, just watching a man play out a tired role. Mercer came closer, holding the bag up. "I found this under the passenger seat. Do you know what it is?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He glanced around, not in panic, not looking for support. He looked at a traffic pole nearby where a street camera was mounted, then turned back to Mercer's eyes. "You better make sure that camera's not filming from behind you," Elijah said, loud enough for at least 3 people nearby to hear. A short silence followed. Mercer froze. His hand tightened slightly around the zip bag, as if to recheck reality. But truth needs no verification. It just stands there, in the eyes of an old man who didn't need to shout, explain, or beg. Mercer signaled for handcuffs. "You're under arrest on suspicion of drug possession." Elijah didn't resist. He let his wrists be bound, eyes still on his granddaughter sitting silently in the car. She didn't understand what was happening, but the way her grandfather said nothing, the way he stood tall, kept her from crying. She only gripped her backpack straps tightly. And then, as Mercer began reading the Miranda rights, Elijah slowly turned his head toward a teenager filming from across the street. Their eyes met. Elijah gave a slight nod, so subtle almost no one noticed. Not a call for help, but an acknowledgement that he knew the boy was recording, that some things had to be preserved, not because justice would come quickly, but because truth sometimes only has one chance to survive. The short blast of the patrol car's siren cut through the air like a command that needed no explanation. Mercer stood next to Elijah, hand gripping the cuffs, reciting the Miranda rights like a memorized line. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." His voice was flat, detached, uninterrupted. Elijah remained still, hands tightly cuffed behind his back, gaze steady. Mercer raised his voice slightly to drown out the rising murmurs from the crowd gathering near the school gate, but just as he began, "You have the right to an attorney," Elijah spoke. Not loud, not harsh, just enough to slip between breaths. "Have you ever wondered how many people stay silent not because they're guilty, but because they know that skin color plus no proof still equals guilt?" The words dropped like a stone into still water. Mercer flinched, barely reflexively. He glanced at Elijah, then at the crowd. Silence held for a few seconds, then a black, middle-aged woman with neatly braided hair and a simple shirt stepped off the curb, phone still recording in hand. Her voice shook, but was clear. "He lives near me. He's a good man. Brings his granddaughter to school every morning. You can't do this." Mercer turned toward her, eyes dark. People stick up for their own kind. He shoved Elijah toward the patrol car, but the words didn't quiet the crowd. They stoked the fire. More phones came out. An older woman muttered, "He handled my granddaughter's divorce case. He's not some lowlife." A teen who had been filming casually now zoomed in on Mercer's face. A heavy-set man near a utility pole was on the phone. "That's Mr. Elijah. Used to be a big deal, not just some nobody." Mercer tightened his grip on Elijah's cuffs, lowered his head, as if to push through the process quickly, to keep control. But Elijah's posture did not bend. No resistance, no riot. Just sunlight casting long shadows over 2 figures, one enforcing, one unmoved. Dozens of eyes watched, doubt growing behind each lens, each whisper. The voice of the uniform no longer held truth by default. Across the street stood Trevor Banks, his name tag still new from last week. Not originally assigned here, he'd been redirected to assist at the school gate, a light shift for a rookie officer, until now. From his post, Trevor had seen everything. Mercer knocking on the glass, the old man stepping out upright, calm, compliant. He heard the woman's protest, saw the little girl's wide, silent eyes in the car. But he didn't move. His hand tightened around his belt. His thumb brushed his holster. A reflex, nothing more. No one told him to freeze. But no one trained him for moments like this either, when procedure checked out, but the truth felt wrong. An older man with salt and pepper hair and a sun-faded shirt came up beside him. He didn't look at Trevor, just at the patrol car. His voice was gravelly from years of cigarettes, but struck like iron. "You a cop? You know who that is? That's a retired judge. Helped my son beat a wrongful conviction last year. If they humiliate him like this, how much justice do you think is left?" Trevor didn't respond. He looked at the man briefly, then looked away. The question didn't expect an answer. It settled like sweat on skin in a summer heat wave. Meanwhile, Mercer dragged Elijah toward the car, forceful and final, as if silencing the last voice in the crowd. The car door slammed shut with a sharp clack. From the crowd, the teen moved toward the woman who had spoken earlier. He offered his phone, video still rolling. "I got it. Post it. They can't bury this again." Her hands trembled as she took it. Lips tight, swallowing a heavy lump, Trevor saw all of it. He knew if that video captured the right angles, it would unravel Mercer's whole story. The weight of that made his hand stay at his belt longer than usual. The patrol car pulled away slowly. Tires pressed into the smooth asphalt, leaving behind a dry scar in the twilight. Trevor remained rooted. His hand still rested on his belt, not from caution, but because letting go might cause something inside him to collapse. He didn't speak, he didn't move, but his eyes stayed locked on the car driving off, as if it carried more than a man in cuffs, as if it took with it the last breath of silence he knew he should have broken. The interrogation room on the second floor had nothing but a stainless steel table, 2 hard plastic chairs, a dim yellow light bulb, and the low hum of the air conditioner, like a heavy breath trying to stay hidden. Elijah Turner sat upright, hands on the table as if waiting for an important meeting, not freshly handcuffed for possession of illegal substances. He didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't request anything. He just sat there, breathing evenly, eyes fixed on the frosted glass through which shadows passed, like he was timing a chess game that hadn't started. Mercer sat at an angle, not too far, but not close enough to provoke physical tension. His hands rested on the table. A pen rolled a short circle before stopping under his thumb. The report form lay before him, each line written in practiced, steady strokes. The subject showed signs of non-cooperation during the search, displayed aloof behavior, avoided answering direct questions about the suspicious package, failed to provide a reasonable explanation for the item's origin. Cold, mechanical words. Mercer didn't look up. He seemed to be staging a scene in his mind, one where he wrote the script, directed the cast, and fed lines to the lead. A young officer stood in the corner of the room, clutching a folder, eyes flicking to the report. He said nothing, but his tight lips and clenched hands betrayed a thought he couldn't bring himself to say. Elijah glanced at him briefly, then looked back down, still silent. Mercer kept writing. A faint smirk appeared as he wrote. The subject showed no reaction to the discovery of evidence, a typical sign of someone familiar with similar situations. The line wasn't for the report, it was to frame the narrative. Elijah finally spoke, calmly, clearly, each word standing on its own. "You'd better make the logic sound enough that no one sees it's a script, because if your words can't save you, neither will your writing." Mercer paused, didn't look up, then gave a dry chuckle and muttered, "You talk too much," as he kept writing. A new line of ink landed on the page, but it wasn't just ink. It was a mask Mercer built around the power he believed untouchable. Elijah knew better. Reports weren't the truth, they were cover stories. And every mask has seams. All it takes is the right moment to pull it off. Outside, Trevor Banks leaned against the one-way hallway glass, watching the silent exchange. From his side, every movement was visible. Inside, no one knew he was there. Elijah sat like a stone. Mercer scribbled on. No one spoke, yet to Trevor it all sounded loud, every word exploding silently. Not screams, but a suffocating tension that filled the space. His hand was in his coat pocket, resting on a small silver USB drive. He didn't know why he brought it today, maybe out of habit from the academy, or maybe something inside him had prepared for this moment long before he understood it. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe steadily, but his breath wasn't steady. It couldn't be. The memory of Elijah in cuffs burned in his mind. No begging, no fury, just a look that asked, "Will you let this continue or stop it now?" And then that man's voice echoed again. "Do you know who he is? A retired judge, the one who helped clear my son's wrongful conviction." Trevor turned away, trying to shake the thought, but it stuck to him like red dust on the back of his uniform. Another officer passed by, raised an eyebrow. "What's with the face? You look like you saw a ghost." Trevor forced a smile. "It's nothing. Probably just not used to the smell of the interrogation room yet." The officer chuckled and walked off. Trevor stayed still until the hallway emptied. Then he turned and walked quickly to the tech room, his assigned night post, where he'd be alone. The room was cold, not from air conditioning, but from the harsh fluorescent light and rows of computers set up like a lab. He locked the door, sat down, and plugged in his phone. The monitor flickered to life. A folder of video files opened. He didn't skip ahead, not 1 second. From the moment Mercer approached Elijah's car, tapped on the window, pulled the white zip bag from his pocket, and Elijah just turned to look at the lamppost where the camera was mounted, it all played in full. The glow from the screen lit Trevor's face. Around him only the low hum of machinery, like the breath of a tired metallic beast. When the footage showed Elijah being shoved into the vehicle, Trevor froze. His eyes stayed open, head lowered slightly. Then he closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. No more, no less. Like a ritual. He opened a drawer, pulled out the USB, and plugged it in. No one asked what he was doing. No one said a word, but in his mind, one voice whispered, "If you don't act, then you're part of it too." Inside every person, there's a battle no one sees, until the day they have to choose a side with their own hand. Elijah Turner's Ford Crown Victoria was towed into the internal inspection yard the following morning. The process was quick, almost mechanical. Record the VIN, check the plates, glance through the interior to verify evidence. The 2 technical officers didn't know much about the case, they were just following orders. But when the younger one leaned through the windshield and flipped a switch near the side mirror column, a faint click sounded, and the system had rebooted. A green LED blinked. This car had a dash cam, not a front-facing one, but a specialized interior-facing model, and it had been recording. The footage was extracted and brought to the central tech room. A large screen lit up. The initial image was blurry, backlit, and low resolution, but after a few adjustments, the video became clearer. Driver's seat, passenger seat, central aisle. Then they saw it. A man in a police uniform leaning in from the passenger side. He shone a flashlight, rummaging as if looking for a mosquito in a sealed box. But then from his left chest pocket, his hand slid out a small Ziploc bag, almost invisible unless you paused at the right frame. That hand quickly moved beneath the seat. 3 seconds later, the officer raised his head and shouted, "There are drugs here!" No one in the room turned the sound on. Only the soft hum of computer cooling fans and intermittent keystrokes filled the space. An older tech officer frowned, braced himself on the table, and slowly nodded. The younger one glanced over, said nothing. There was no debate, none needed. The scene said enough. One of them spoke up. "Do we escalate this?" But the other cut in. Quietly, "Wait, we've been told to verify first. Archive it internally and encrypt the file name." No further discussion. That afternoon, a quick internal meeting was held. Present were Lieutenant Jenkins, a few supervisors, and a representative from Internal Affairs. On the printed incident report, already distributed, there was no mention of a camera in the vehicle. A middle-aged man in a suit, no name tag, raised his eyebrows as he scanned the report, then looked up and asked, "Why does the incident report omit the camera?" No one answered. No coughing. No phones ringing. But in a few eyes, something shifted. Not words yet, but like the first crack in a concrete slab, thought to be sealed for good. Later that day, an inventory of personal effects was completed in a small room behind the holding area. On the table were 3 items: an old leather wallet, a flip phone, and a worn silver wristwatch. The records officer Carter Wells moved with practiced ease. He'd been doing this for 6 years, cataloging everything from fruit knives to crumpled receipts, but when he opened Elijah Turner's wallet, his eyes paused for a second. In the left pocket, folded like an ID, was a thin metal card, not thicker than a credit card, but gleaming with the cold sheen of authority. Embossed on its surface, Federal Civil Oversight, Senior Advisor, along with a federal ID number. Carter immediately searched the internal system. The card, correct format, correct type, was issued only to special advisors of the Council for Public Conduct Oversight, responsible for monitoring law enforcement agencies at both the state and federal levels. The holder had access to sensitive data and could request independent investigations if misconduct was suspected. Carter shivered slightly. Elijah Turner wasn't some mistaken old man. He was a high-level operative within the top oversight echelon, whose mere identification could freeze an entire investigation and force every procedure to be reviewed from scratch. Suspicion deepened when Carter was ordered to extract body cam footage to supplement the file. In the clip, as Mercer confiscated Elijah's wallet, he opened it, flipped to the pocket with the card. There was a slight pause, not even a full second, as he looked at the card. Then, without reading, confirming, or reporting it, he closed the wallet and shoved it into his pocket with his bare hand, almost deliberately avoiding it. No mention of the card appeared in the report. The seizure log simply read, "Brown leather wallet, no ID inside." The clip was played during an emergency internal meeting. The room was silent. Lieutenant Jenkins sat with his hands clasped, saying nothing. A young officer murmured from the back, "If he knew who the guy was and still did that, that's not arrogance. That's an attempt to bury his identity." Another officer nodded, eyes hardening. This wasn't just procedural misconduct anymore. It wasn't a technical oversight. It was a conscious choice, a targeted attempt to eliminate the only protective leverage the detainee had. That little card, just a sliver of metal, was now the first legal lever. It forced the investigation team to re-examine every past file involving Mercer. How many reports lacked personal identification? How many cases were marked unable to verify identity? And how many people had been swept into the system because no one acknowledged who they were? Elijah still hadn't said a word, but his silence now was forcing the whole system to reopen every dusty page. Trevor's car sat quietly in the far corner of the police station parking lot, where the yellow streetlight draped the windshield like a curtain hiding his thoughts. His shift was over, the clock ticking past 9:12 p.m., but Trevor hadn't left. His hand rested on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the phone glowing in the passenger seat. The video, the clip showing Mercer pulling the zip bag from his uniform and discovering it under Elijah's seat, was still there, tucked away in a private folder. No one had forced him to open it, but he'd watched it 6 times. Each time, his grip had tightened. This time, he didn't open it to watch. He opened it to do something else. Trevor launched his personal email app, an old account he used during law school before he became a cop. He didn't use his department email or the internal network. The recipient was a hard-to-remember string of characters, an address he'd found in a tiny corner of the Carter and Lowenstein LLP website, the law firm now representing Elijah Turner. He hesitated at the subject line. Finally, he typed only 2 words, "This clip." In the body, he typed slowly, "This clip will show you that you're not crazy. No one deserves to be buried under something called procedure. My TB." He didn't sign his full name. He didn't add anything else. His hand shook slightly as he attached the file, an MP4, small in size, but heavy as stone on his chest. When he hit send, the soft whoosh was barely audible, but tonight, to Trevor, it sounded like a knife slicing through paper. After he dropped the phone onto the passenger seat and slumped forward against the wheel, his breath came heavy. 3 beats. First, he closed his eyes. The second, his heart thudded harder. The third, like a drum marking the point of no return. No sirens, no internal alarms, no gun drawn, But Trevor knew he had just fired the first shot in a war. With a single click, he leaned back, staring at the roof of the car in the dark. What Mercer did wasn't the first wrong thing Trevor had ever seen, but it was the first time he dared to put his hand on the board, not knowing what side he stood on. He wasn't hoping for praise. He didn't see himself as a hero. He only knew one thing. If he woke up tomorrow without having sent that clip, every time he put on the uniform afterward would feel twice as heavy. When the engine started, he didn't turn on the headlights. He let the car idle for a few seconds, then pulled out quietly. The road ahead had no signs telling him whether he was right or wrong, but at least this time he had chosen the direction himself. The next morning, Trevor Banks arrived at the station earlier than usual. He didn't speak to anyone, just went straight to the break room, removed his duty belt and opened his locker. As the door swung open, a small piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was wrinkled, the handwriting tilted, ink in blue. Be careful who you choose to be real for. No signature, no symbol, just a single line floating in the already heavy air. Trevor bent down, picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then folded it and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't rip it, didn't crumple it, he just kept it as a piece of proof no one wanted to admit was real. The shift began like any other. Check the task list, unit roll call, and duty assignments. But the eyes were different. When Trevor stepped into the command room, the conversation dipped a beat. A veteran officer, Miller, walked past him while flipping through a report, patted his shoulder lightly, as if in encouragement, but the tone betrayed something else. Looks like you're louder than the rest of us. Trevor nodded, didn't reply. He wasn't sure what it meant, but the way it was said, in a room quiet enough to hear paper turn, made it feel like a warning. During lunch, at a nearby table, a group of officers debated the Elijah case. One of them scoffed. Lawyers, man, always cutting and stitching videos to look good. Pick the right angle, add some voiceover, and make the guy look like a saint. Then the press jumps in and trial by internet does the rest. Trevor sat silently, eating his now cold sandwich. His stomach tightened. No one pointed a finger at him, but no one looked him in the eye anymore either. He began to understand. The price of that file wasn't in what he sent. It was in how he was slowly being erased from the picture. In a room full of laughter, he sat still, and none of the laughter belonged to him. At the end of the day, while organizing some case files at his desk, the internal phone gave a short, clipped ring. The secretary's voice came through. Lieutenant Jenkins wants to see you. Room 302. As soon as possible. Trevor put down his pen, fastened his cuff button, and knocked on the door to room 302 exactly 1 minute later. Inside, the room was neat, minimal, nothing much but a snake plant and a shelf of case files. Lieutenant Carla Jenkins stood with her back to him, arms crossed, staring out the window. When he stepped in, she didn't turn around right away. She just spoke. Soft as a draft, but every word struck like a hammer. I need to know what side you're on. No threats, no accusations, just one question, but it drew a line straight across the room. And Trevor understood. From now on, every choice would carry a cost, and silence was no longer a neutral position. The small cafe sat tucked into a quiet corner of the city's southern district, a place where no one stayed on the phone for more than 3 minutes, and no one asked for names. Elijah Turner arrived on time, just as he had for the past 30 years, even for meetings where no one invited him. The place wasn't crowded. An old radio played soft jazz. At the back table sat a man, head shaved, shoulders in a worn coat, hand resting on a faded gray fabric bag. He didn't stand, didn't wave, just looked at Elijah with an expression devoid of surprise, as if he'd always known he would come. Elijah recognized him almost instantly. Darius Hill. He sat down. No order, no greetings. Darius placed the bag on the table and unzipped it partially. Inside was an old portable hard drive, marked with a strip of black tape and a note in silver marker, CH12, internal, unedited. For a few seconds, no one touched it, just the sound of breathing and a spoon tapping glass from a nearby table. Darius broke the silence first. I used to be a cop, you know that. 8 years. Patrol and training. My last case had no guns, no casualties. Just a tampered report, a deleted statement, and one recording. That I kept. Elijah didn't ask why he never went public. He already knew. Some recordings don't save the innocent. They bury the person who holds them. Darius went on, steady and blunt. There are 6 audio files on this. 4 from internal meetings. 2 from live radio chatter when the guys were cleaning up the scene. I didn't take them for revenge. I took them because I couldn't believe it happened in the same room where I once swore an oath. Elijah looked straight into his eyes, not with judgment or pity, just as if weighing the final puzzle piece now laid before him. Why keep it until now? Darius gave a slight smirk. Because if I spoke then, I'd be branded a traitor. If I stayed silent forever, I'd be an accomplice. I didn't want to be either. Elijah nodded slowly, resting his hand on the drive, but not yet taking it. I remember seeing you 5 years ago. The case with the post office clerk was wrongly arrested because of a license plate mix-up. Yeah, took 6 months to clear that case. Took 6 days to clear my name out of the system. Between the 2 men, one who once wore a judge's robe, one who once wore body armor, there was nothing but the hard drive lying silent like a block of ice, waiting to crack. Elijah finally picked it up. Thanks for keeping it. Darius pulled out an unlit cigarette, spun it 3 times between his fingers, then slipped it back in the pack. I didn't keep it out of courage, kept it because I knew one day someone would need it to rip the seal off the truth. And it looks like that day is today. Elijah Turner didn't play the files immediately. He placed the hard drive on the desk in a small room at the end of the hall, the space he still used to review old case files, a habit from his years on the bench. The lamplight cast a warm gold glow across the rough silver casing, the label labeled as if 12 deep motive, internal, unedited, nearly faded into the steel. He sat, plugged it into his private computer, and turned off all Wi-Fi. Not because he feared being watched, but because what he was about to hear didn't belong on any network but the one connected to truth. The first file was audio from a meeting room. No video, but the voices were so clear he could imagine the ceiling tiles. A middle-aged male voice, gravelly but firm, spoke like he was reading from a training script. If the subject won't cooperate, you know how to make them. We use tools. We don't need a courtroom telling us how to question people. Elijah didn't flinch. He opened the second file, a crowded conversation, mixed with tapping pens and shuffling chairs. A younger voice, faster, let out a dry laugh before speaking. Don't let any case slip just because there's no solid evidence. If a statement doesn't match, make it unverifiable. The public won't know, and the press sure won't. Elijah's hand rested on the mouse, unmoving. His eyes stayed fixed on the timeline of the file, as if it held the spirit of something long rotten. The third file, an internal seminar, featured a deep, even emotionless male voice. Body cams are for protecting our own, not for sending them to jail. If anyone doesn't get that, they should resign. No one objected. No one laughed. Just silence after each directive, the kind of silence not born from agreement, but obedience. Elijah closed his eyes. He was not naive. 3 decades on the bench, he'd read thousands of reports that reeked of cover-up. But what he heard now wasn't personal misconduct. It wasn't a few bad cops. It was a system quietly redrawing the line between right and wrong, and training people to stand inside it like it was normal. The final line from the 4th audio echoed in his head, over and over. Don't let any case slip just cause there's no solid evidence. Elijah opened a drawer and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved decisively, dialing a number he'd memorized long ago but never used. Graham Rourke, lead counsel for the State Internal Oversight Committee. The call connected after 2 rings. Before the voice on the other end could speak, Elijah began, I have a chain of recordings you can no longer ignore. The only question is, are you ready to hear it, or will someone else hear it first? Silence. Then Rourke's voice lowered, steady and sharp, like a leather chair collapsing under weight. I'll be there, and this time I'm not bringing a stenographer. That afternoon, in a law office on the 3rd floor of an old downtown building, no one turned on the overhead lights. 3 people sat together around a desk, lit only by a computer screen and the slanted rays of the late sun cutting through the blinds. They didn't need more light. The truth they were confronting was already bright enough to chill anyone to the bone. Lawrence, a data analyst who once left the Federal Investigative Unit to stop smelling forged paper ever again, opened a summary table. Names Mercer, the past 3 years. I filtered by badge number and detainment records. Total of 27 reports. That's not a small number. Julia, a young paralegal with glasses who typed like a machine, began opening files in chronological order. When she reached the 4th report, she paused, frowning. Wait, this opening line is identical to the first. All 3 leaned in. The sentence stood out clearly. Subject avoided eye contact, delayed in responding to cooperation requests. Julia scrolled back to the earlier report. Identical. Then she opened the 5th, 6th, and 7th reports, and the pattern repeated disturbingly. Lawrence said nothing. He simply ran a command to search for that phrase across all 27 files. The system returned results in 3 seconds. 19 reports used that exact wording. Some rearranged the sentence structure, but the essence is the same. Quincy, the former legal advisor from the DA's office who had reviewed thousands of case reports, leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. No one writes like that unless they're not really. No one in the room disagreed. His words dropped like a stone into a pond already stretched tight. Julia continued scrolling through the scene descriptions. The next recurring phrase appeared. Suspicious item found under the seat. Another file. Powder-like substance located in the lower compartment. And another. Unable to verify origin of item as subject did not provide an alibi. This wasn't mere similarity. It was a structure, a framework. Lawrence stood, wrote 3 phrases on the whiteboard like formulas. Avoided eye contact. Suspicious item under seat. No clear alibi. Then he turned back and said, "These aren't descriptions. They're templates." In the silent room, the truth didn't arrive with an explosion, but through a cold chain of repetition. Reports, once assumed to be routine, each like a brick in the wall of an already decided outcome, now revealed their true form. A sequence of reused lines, like pre-filled forms. All it took was changing the name, the date, and repeating. Trevor Banks had cracked the system. Darius Hill had held up the mirror of forgotten memories. But that afternoon, bathed in slanted light and the hum of cooling fans, Elijah's legal team finally realized Mercer wasn't inventing stories. He was copying. In a system that allowed such a thing to exist, while Julia and Lawrence continued combing through disturbingly similar phrasing, Quincy, the quietest of the group, began scanning the signature blocks at the end of each report. On his screen, all 27 files appeared side by side. The signatory names were clearly listed in the right-hand column. Almost immediately, he raised his eyebrows. His mouse hovered, clicked to filter. 18 of the 27 reports bore the same signature, Sergeant Henry Loomis. A man thought to have stepped away from the system, yet his fingerprint remained stuck to a crumbling wall. No one spoke, but the air seemed to pause. Lawrence searched administrative records. Loomis retired last September. Julia typed, cross-referencing reports dated after that. 4 new names showed up, but one replaced him most frequently, Ramon Ellis. Each signature looked not just familiar but identical, so precise that Lawrence had to zoom in to confirm no tremor, no drift, no shift in position. This signature, he said quietly, is the only thing that hasn't changed in 3 years of repeated reports. For a long moment, no one said a word. Then Julia, sharp-minded but usually quiet, set her pen down and asked, as if thinking aloud, if the people signing knew it was wrong, what made them sign anyway? It wasn't a new question, but this time, it wasn't about emotion. It was a direct strike at the logic propping up the whole system. Elijah had been standing by the bookshelf, listening from the beginning. He stepped forward, picked up a copy of a report, and examined Loomis's signature. The handwriting was firm, unhesitant. He nodded and said slowly, "It's not because they didn't know right from wrong. It's because they knew if they didn't sign, they'd be removed from the table." Silence. A single beat. Then, Elijah set the report down, his voice firm. "Prepare the full cross-reconcile file, all 27 cases. I don't want the press to get it first, and I don't want social media turning it into a hashtag." "Where do we send it, sir?" Quincy asked. "Send it directly to the Federal Internal Oversight Committee. Include a statement with each signature sample." He looked up, eyes steady. If the system once believed it had the right to legitimize every failure with a stamp, then let that stamp answer to the truth. During a routine review session, while Elijah's legal team was cross-referencing Darius's old recordings to supplement the file sent to the Oversight Committee, Julia suddenly froze at a fleeting phrase. It wasn't a key statement or a direct admission. Just something muttered mid-conversation in a covertly recorded meeting, the voice low and slightly distorted. "Those cases got passed up to the gatekeepers, not handled at the platoon level anymore. At first, they just flagged it for later review. But as Lawrence dug through archived material Darius had sent earlier, fragmented testimonies, dismissed internal complaints, brief incident reports from retired officers, they began to notice something strange. The name gatekeepers never appeared in any official documents, manuals, or organizational charts, yet it kept resurfacing like a code word that didn't need explaining. Lawrence uncovered 3 anonymous whistleblower letters, marked as internally resolved in the department's old admin system. One came from a behavioral monitor tech, reassigned to evidence storage without explanation, after raising concerns about tampered access logs. The letter read, "I don't think I touch the inner circle, but apparently just seeing it is enough to get pushed out." Another wrote, "We were told never to say the word gatekeepers outside meeting hours, even though no one knew exactly who that was." The deeper they dug, the colder it felt, not from overt threat, but from the organized vagueness shielding the very structure itself. Mercer, for all he had done, began to look less like a rogue figure and more like a model operative, allowed to exist, maybe even protected, by people with no names, no faces, only signatures and silence at just the right moments. And Elijah wasn't directly involved in the review. He was at the far end of the room, scanning old administrative files. But when he heard Julia repeat the phrase from the recording, he froze. Something in his mind brushed against a long-forgotten memory. He stood, walked over, flipped through a stack of papers, and stopped at a yellowed page, corners curled. A note from 2004, an unofficial statement from a retired inspector, was once sent to Elijah's office while he was still in service, but never escalated to a formal investigation. He read it slowly. If a case needs to be handled quietly, the gatekeepers are the ones who push the button. He had once dismissed it as a bitter metaphor, the grumbling of a disillusioned ex-cop, but now, surrounded by stacks of similar memos, familiar signatures, and unexplained transfers, it no longer felt metaphorical. Gatekeepers, never listed in any official document, were beginning to emerge not as a clear-cut entity, but as a shadow framework embedded wherever power wore a stamp and needed no reason. The command office on the 4th floor wasn't remarkable, with light gray walls, old filing cabinets, and a wall clock ticking slowly. Carla Jenkins sat behind the desk, her uniform neatly pressed, her face nearly unchanged from a decade ago, only her eyes were deeper, quieter. Elijah laid a file on her desk. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The red room cover had one word, gatekeepers. Jenkins didn't open it right away. She stared at it as if looking at something she'd tried to forget. Then, slowly, she turned the first page. Her eyes paused on a list of familiar signatures, Loomis, Ellis, Mercer, then drifted across a simple diagram of internal approval flow. When she reached a name circled in red with the note, "Not listed in official structure," her shoulder twitched, barely, but Elijah saw it, and he understood. She'd known that name before. Jenkins closed the file without finishing it. She leaned back, eyes on Elijah, not evasive, but not at ease. "More than 10 years ago," she began, her voice low and raspy, "a junior lieutenant asked why an internal misconduct case never made it to the oversight panel. At that meeting, he asked, One question. 3 weeks later, he was reassigned to evidence storage for not fitting the field coordination profile. He waited. Jenkins continued without looking up. Back then, I drafted a response. I had it ready, but I never sent it. Because one night I received a report, unsigned, with my name replaced by someone else's. No explanation, no discussion. The next morning, the official version was submitted without a line for me. Elijah asked quietly, "And you stayed silent after that?" Jenkins nodded, slowly, like confessing a debt. "I used to think I would do the right thing, until I realized there is no right if it means you disappear. In this system, right isn't what you do, it's whether anyone remembers you after you've done it." She pushed the file back toward Elijah. No answers, no requests, just her hand resting on the folder, like a seal made of flesh and memory. Then she spoke, softly but impossible to ignore. "Officer Banks did something none of us dared. He lit up the one place no one's ever wanted to walk into." The room fell quiet again. But it wasn't the quiet of closure. It was the quiet before something unstoppable begins. That morning, the courtroom was packed. People had lined up in the hallway before the doors even opened, mostly journalists, freelance reporters, and those who tracked politically charged trials. Though technically a preliminary hearing, the tension inside matched that of a final verdict. Each wooden-cushioned chair creaked sharply as people sat. No one spoke. No one smiled. The air felt thick, like everyone was waiting for a performance whose ending had already been written, just missing a narrator. The prosecutor entered right on time. Cold gray suit, rimless glasses, voice sharp as a box cutter. The defendant, Elijah Turner, formerly a federal oversight advisor, was found in possession of a bag of illegal substances hidden beneath the driver's seat of his personal vehicle. There is no evidence to suggest he was framed. He struck the phrase, "no evidence," like a nail. Then he turned to the bench and requested to display visual evidence. The screen lit up with photos from the scene, crystal clear. The semi-imperandi's white zip bag being pulled from under the seat, Mercer handling the seizure. A close-up of Elijah's face as he was cuffed, eyes turned away, as if avoiding the moment. Each photo came with minimal captions, but everyone understood. The images weren't about information. They were about shaping perception. Elijah as guilty. No video was presented, no dash cam, no moving frames, just stills, frozen and fragmented, as if the entire truth had unfolded only in those motionless seconds. Elijah's defense lawyer tried to object, but was cut off. The judge allowed the prosecution to continue uninterrupted, citing the need to maintain analytical flow. The whole room turned toward Elijah. He didn't flinch. No head shake, no anger. He just sat, back straight, fingers laced on the table, eyes forward like a man listening to a lecture he'd already read years ago. Some waited for a reaction, a breakdown, a cry, an outburst. But Elijah offered none. He held to silence like it was the only weapon the system hadn't stripped from him. Someone in the gallery whispered, "He's not speaking because there's nothing left to say." But Julia, seated 2 rows ahead, heard it and didn't take her eyes off the man sitting alone at the front, because she knew this wasn't a resignation. This was prepared silence, held for the one moment when words could shatter everything built on counterfeit truths. At the very back, Trevor Banks sat in a public observer's seat, the chair creaking faintly as he shifted. No uniform, no name tag. No one recognized him, or if they did, they didn't care. He looked like a young man watching a trial that had nothing to do with him. Shoulders slightly hunched, arms folded tight, like he was holding himself together. When the prosecutor finished, concluding, "The defendant cannot present any exceptional circumstances. We therefore recommend prosecution under Clause 198C for possession with unclear intent," Trevor stood up. No one asked him to, no one invited him. But he rose, decisively, without pause, and walked toward the witness stand. The room stirred. A wave of whispers swept through like wind brushing the top of a still forest. The judge frowned. "Who are you?" Trevor opened a slim leather folder, pulled out a USB drive. "I'm an unlisted witness. But the video on this, if it isn't played today, then everything we're doing here is just theater. A few coughed. One reporter whispered, "He's a cop, young one. Probably the one on shift during the arrest." Elijah's lawyer leaned in slightly but showed no surprise. Elijah remained still, just turned his head, looking slightly toward Trevor, saying nothing. But it wasn't suspicion in his eyes. It was the look of a man who already knew something could happen, just not when. The judge hesitated. The prosecutor objected, but after several tense minutes and with the weight of every media camera in the room pointed toward the small drive in Trevor's hand, the court allowed the footage. The condition, if the video didn't relate directly to the incident, Trevor would be penalized for disrupting the session. The lights dimmed, the front screen lit up. Dashcam footage came into view from the rearview mirror angle, showing the front seat interior, sunlight streaking across the dashboard. Then, slowly, unmistakably, Mercer leaned in, reached into his coat, pulled out a small zip bag and slipped it beneath the seat. 4 seconds later, he straightened and shouted, "I found drugs here." The room froze. A few observers exhaled sharply. The prosecutor lowered his head, pen slipping from his hand to the floor. The defense said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The truth had spoken for itself. Elijah finally turned fully around, eyes locking with Trevor, who stood still, arms at his side, face tense but steady. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, but in Elijah's silent nod was a thank you left unspoken, an unvoiced acknowledgement, and something deeper still, a kind of power no system could measure, the quiet trust between two people who chose to stand on the side of the light. No one in the courtroom spoke after the clip ended. The screen remained lit, frozen on the final frame. Deputy Colin Mercer's hand still gripping the plastic zip bag, his face fully visible in the dash cam's angled view, no shadows, no ambiguity. The judge stared at the screen as if he still couldn't believe it was real. The prosecutor sat motionless, chin pulled in, pen untouched. Elijah Turner, silent throughout the session, slowly turned his head toward the public gallery, as if checking one last time who was truly paying attention. In that heavy silence, the first sound wasn't from the court, but from a journalist's phone, forgotten on loud. Then another. Then more notifications, messages, tweets, and alerts. The outside world had seen the video, live from a local news channel's stream, broadcast instantly the moment the USB was inserted, uninterrupted and raw. Outside, the crowd that had gathered since morning, initially to observe, photograph, and hang, began shifting. Not in chaos, but with momentum. No cue was needed. No megaphone. What they saw spoke loudly enough. A young woman at the barricade yelled, "They knew he was set up," another voice called back, "and they still put him on trial." The call echoed down the block like a silent chain reaction. Signs rose, mostly handwritten in marker. "The system isn't broken, it is the problem. We won't stay silent." Mercer wasn't the only one. Police began forming soft barriers, but no one rioted. No one threw anything. No injuries. No violence. And yet everything was erupting in the way only truth can, when kept buried too long, and finally rises up to tear through every layer of polished, fear-built framing that once kept it hidden. Inside, nearly a minute passed before the judge called a recess. He gave no reason, didn't consult a file. His entire posture seemed to cave into the bench. The prosecution requested a suspension of proceedings to verify the new evidence's authenticity, but no one answered. From the second that video played, every protest had already lost its footing. In the antechamber, Elijah remained seated. Trevor stood by the door, unsure whether to stay or leave. Elijah's lawyer approached and leaned in, saying, "We have grounds to move for dismissal, but this isn't just your trial anymore." Elijah didn't respond. He closed his eyes, as if tuning into the subtle tremor running through the system, a faint vibration, like hearing the first crack echo up through the base of a concrete bridge. It wasn't collapsing yet, but anyone who understood foundations knew, if you don't rebuild the base, every courtroom is just white paint over rot. On the news screens in the lobby, headlines rolled in. Footage reveals staged arrest. Deputy Mercer under emergency investigation. suspended. Oversight committee convenes at 8 p.m. Online, the term gatekeepers surged into the top search rankings. People asked, who are they? How many times has this happened? How many Elijahs had no camera? The story was no longer about one man. It had become a fracture in a door the world thought was sealed shut. When Elijah was escorted out of the courtroom, he walked slowly, uncuffed, unrestrained. Some in the audience rose, not to cheer, not to record, just to nod, the way one acknowledges someone who survived to tell the truth. A man who didn't shout, didn't throw fists, didn't bleed to be heard. He waited, and when the moment came, he put the truth exactly where it needed to be. And when the truth appears, guns aren't needed. A system can still tremble. Trevor didn't ask why when told to go to the 4th floor, East Administrative Wing, room 6C. He just nodded, took the file, and walked. The East Wing wasn't a place people like him usually entered. The rooms there were rarely occupied. The hallway lights were always on. But the silence had a strange weight, the faint scent of fresh paint on the wooden paneling hanging in the air like a reminder. This was not a place for people who asked questions. When Trevor knocked, the man inside wore no name tag, just a dark shirt, and greeted him with a flat, even tone. He introduced himself briefly. I'm with the State Personnel Coordination Group. Just a brief conversation, nothing disciplinary, nothing legal. The entire exchange was delivered in a calm, curated tone. The man didn't focus on fault, didn't use controlling language. Instead, he repeated 2 words, stability and transition. He said the system needed people like Trevor, young, sharp, principled, but also needed to moderate the pace of reform. A strange phrase, but one that kept recurring. Trevor didn't interrupt, didn't object. He listened and quickly understood the real message, a reassignment, an internal transfer to an administrative role. No patrols, no field duty, no complaints, no casework. A position appropriate for your transitional phase. The wording made it sound like Trevor had just survived a professional accident and was being eased out. The man slid over a printed job description along with a revised salary offer, 18% higher than his current rate. No interviews, no background checks, just a signature. He leaned forward slightly, voice still as polished as a corporate HR meeting. We appreciate your courage. But as you know, even a system under repair needs stability to correct itself. What you did, many people are grateful, but it's best if it stops here. Things will go more smoothly. Elijah Turner has already made enough waves, hasn't he? The question wasn't meant to be answered. It was meant to hang in the space between them, a quiet pressure, delivered not through words, but through everything left unsaid. No threats, no ultimatums, no line telling Trevor he must comply. But each sentence, each paper slid across the table, each small nod from the man pulsed with the same rhythm. Staying meant trouble. Leaving, on their terms, meant mutual respect. Trevor didn't sign. He didn't refuse either. He simply said, I need more time. The man nodded, stood up, and extended his hand like they'd just concluded a negotiation. But as Trevor stepped out into the eastern corridor, he didn't feel lighter. What swelled in his chest wasn't doubt, but the sharp clarity of recognizing for the first time the shape of a hand that only pats your back when you stay silent enough to survive. He hadn't made it far before the door behind him opened again, not because he was being called back, but because someone else was entering. Carla Jenkins, in uniform, a folder tucked neatly in her left hand, walked directly into room 6C with such speed and certainty that the man inside didn't have time to hide his displeased glance. She didn't ask for permission, she simply stood there, eyes scanning past Trevor, locking onto the man who had just offered the personnel proposal. Her voice was steady, not loud, but loud enough that no one could mistake it for a private conversation. I'm here to submit an investigative file related to witness Trevor Banks. This file requires his continued involvement in reviewing evidence tampering. She placed the folder on the table, hand resting atop it, not pulling back, as if to plant it firmly, unmistakably, a formal request. not to be waved off by hallway deals. The man's brow lifted slightly. Lips tightened but offered no argument. He looked from Trevor to Jenkins, his voice now low. "We're simply looking for a suitable path to avoid unnecessary tension." Jenkins didn't flinch. She tilted her head, gaze firm. "Tension comes from lies, not from those who speak the truth." No reply, no admission. But the silence that followed cracked the room like glass, waiting for someone to breathe too hard. Jenkins turned to Trevor, her tone softer. "You can come with me. There's still work for you to do." Trevor said nothing, but as he walked away, the man's eyes stayed on him, not with hostility, but with the look of someone who had just failed to keep a small cog obedient inside the system. As he exited the east wing, Trevor noticed his hand trembling, not from fear, but because his body wasn't used to rejecting a door opened by such a polite offer. Jenkins didn't rush. He walked beside him at an even pace, saying nothing for almost 2 minutes. Only when they returned to the main administrative area, where heads began to turn at the sight of her, did she stop, turn toward Trevor, and speak clearly, her voice carrying down the hallway. "He is not being reassigned. He is not a problem. He stays because he acted rightly and will continue to do so." The air around them shifted. A few people rose from the duty desk. Some eyes glanced quickly, then looked away. But others lingered. Deeper, longer, as if some had just witnessed something they thought no longer existed in the force. Someone who wasn't cast out for telling the truth. Trevor didn't speak for the rest of that afternoon, but when he returned to his office and sat at his desk, he didn't turn on his computer. He opened a drawer and pulled out the old note, the one someone had once stuck to his locker. "Be careful who you choose to be real for." He placed it on the desk, flipped it over. On the back, in red pen, he wrote a new line. "Be careful with systems if you stay silent too long." For the first time, he folded it in half, not to throw away, but to keep. A reminder that from now on, he was no longer a gatekeeper. He was someone who had stepped through the gate. That evening, the office lights stayed on longer than usual. The crowd outside had thinned. The news had shifted to the financial bulletin, but the room where Elijah and the legal team sat remained heavy with pressure. Lawrence was cross-checking documents. Julia was preparing the update report for the Oversight Committee, and Trevor hadn't said a word since the meeting began, his eyes fixed on a single page he had read at least 5 times. Elijah sat not far away, fingers gently brushing the edge of a worn brown file folder, unlabeled, its corners frayed. When no one spoke, he opened it casually, but the name on the first page froze the room. Colin Mercer, trial, August 2003. The signature at the bottom was his own, Elijah Turner, then a district judge in Fulton County. He didn't read aloud, just left the folder open in front of him and spoke in a low, even tone. 20 years ago, he wasn't a veteran officer, just a rookie cop caught violating protocol during a routine traffic stop. The charge was simple: excessive force causing unnecessary harm to a suspect who had already surrendered. But back then the public had no video, no evidence, and Mercer, with a glowing letter from his captain, was described as promising and in need of further guidance. Elijah paused, then said plainly, "I believed that." No one interrupted. He explained that he had faced 2 choices: pursue criminal charges, which would mean revoking Mercer's badge, or allow internal review with mandatory 6-month retraining. Elijah had just been appointed to the senior judgeship and was seen as a reformist willing to dialogue. He chose leniency. "I thought," Elijah said slowly, "if a young man is pushed out of the system after a first mistake, then no one will have a chance to grow. I believed discipline only works when paired with opportunity." Trevor looked at him, clearly unaware of any of this history. To him, Mercer was a present-day wrecking force, not someone who once carried another man's belief. Julia tightened her grip slightly. All 3 younger people in the room understood. Elijah wasn't confessing to seek forgiveness. He wasn't asking for empathy. He was putting an old piece of memory on the table, one that should have been reckoned with a long time ago. "I signed that judgment," Elijah said, flipping to the last page. "No one pressured me. No one manipulated me. I chose to absolve him, and that pardon left behind an unexploded bullet inside the system. The atmosphere shifted. It was no longer the fatigue of people who'd done their best, but the silence of those who had just heard the real origin of the storm they were fighting. Elijah didn't look up. He tore a copy of the verdict from the folder, folded it into quarters, placed it in a separate envelope, and wrote in ink on the front, "No one else should learn this lesson from me." It wasn't the action of a broken man. It was the choice of someone who once forgave and now refused to forgive the cycle his own judgment had unintentionally enabled. No one said a word after Elijah closed the old file. The air felt like it had lost a thin layer of oxygen, not suffocating, but making it harder to breathe deeply. Julia bowed her head, eyes fixed on the wood grain, where the lights scattered into faint, tangled lines. Lawrence turned his chair in another direction, pretending to check the team's schedule, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Only Trevor kept looking at Elijah, not with blame, not quite with sympathy either, but with the straight honesty of someone young who just realized that sometimes even the best people leave behind the most dangerous gaps, simply by believing in things no longer fit for the time. Elijah recognized that look, and he didn't avoid it. He placed his hands on the table, interlaced his fingers, and spoke softly, as if no one needed to record it. Trust is essential to keeping any system alive, but I confuse two things. Trusting a person is one thing, believing the system will give them room to change is another. He raised his head, eyes direct. I let Mercer off the hook, but it wasn't me who kept him. The system kept him, not to reform him, but to use him. I put faith in an individual. The system saw my pardon as a sign of someone predictable. Trevor looked down. A part of him wanted to ask why Elijah hadn't seen it sooner, but the bigger part, the one that had matured fast in the last few weeks, understood this. When people try to believe in good, they fail to notice what's feeding off their kindness to survive. Elijah kept going, unbroken. When I saw Mercer's name on the arrest report, I wasn't angry. I just felt empty, because that was the name I once signed off on with all good intent. And he, 2 decades later, used the same manipulation, but this time to take down the one who once protected him. It wasn't betrayal. It was a loop of audacity, wrapped in paperwork, protocol, and calculated silence. Elijah's voice stayed steady, like reciting the end of his own chapter. I once thought that if someone was given a second chance, they'd be grateful and live better. But what I forgot was, some people don't want to change. They just need time to learn how to dodge reform and exploit mercy. The team didn't need a conclusion. Everyone in the room understood. What Elijah had just shared wasn't just a personal reckoning. It was a warning about how the system treats second chances as a tool to keep the pliable and cast out the stubborn. Elijah didn't revoke his old pardon. He didn't deny the trust he once placed, but from that night on, he made a choice. No one else would pay the price for his mercy a second time, and if needed, he would be the first to tear down every belief ever built on the idea that everyone wants to be better. It didn't begin with an accusation. It began with a silence that lasted just a little longer than usual in the locker room. The usual sounds of shift change, clicking locks, boots on tile felt unusually thick today, as if everyone had slipped on an invisible layer of gloves to hold back the questions that used to come out without hesitation. A young officer named Connor took off his jacket, sat on the old wooden bench, and looked directly at his friend Jackson before speaking softly, just loud enough not to be missed, but quiet enough to be deniable. If that body cam hadn't been on, would we all have stayed quiet? Jackson didn't respond right away. He bent over, tying his laces, then muttered, "I don't know. Maybe, but it's the first time I've seen someone survive long enough to tell it." Another officer in the room, Alvarez, over 30 years on the force, left before the pre-shift briefing even started. No explanation, no excuse. He just got up and walked out. You could say he was busy, but anyone who'd worked with him knew Alvarez had never missed a single roll call in 18 years. The way he closed the door, not fast, not loud, but with finality, was the kind of exit that said he didn't want to hear another word. What was changing wasn't policy. It wasn't procedure. It was the unspoken trust among those who once stood shoulder to shoulder. The belief that if something went wrong, it would be handled quietly. That trust was gone now. Echoes from the hearings, the leaked audio, and the public testimony of Trevor Banks had begun seeping from the press into the halls of the department. No one mentioned it directly, but people started switching seats in the break room. Those once close to Mercer now avoided saying his name, not out of fear, but because they weren't sure anymore if that closeness was a bond or a liability. A new notice appeared on the internal bulletin board. All discussion of the Turner case is suspended during shifts and in shared areas, until further notice. A plain sheet of white paper, no official logo, but it was posted in 3 of the most visible spots, which made it read more than any official memo. Someone joked, half serious, half probing, "If Mercer gets charged, who's next?" No one answered, but everyone had a list in their head. Not a list of criminals, but of those who had witnessed wrong and said nothing, of those who signed off on reports they hadn't verified. A group of younger officers started meeting quietly in the evenings, not to gossip, not to make plans, just to review news coverage and leak documents together. They didn't speak loudly, they didn't take photos, but when one of them said, "I've done everything by the book, I just don't know what that book means anymore," no one disagreed. The fracture began there, not with explosions, but with the faint crack of tired joints splitting under pressure. A senior officer walked through the hallway, crossing paths with Trevor as he stepped out of the data room. No words were exchanged, but their eyes met, not with resentment, not with loyalty, but with mutual recognition. Things were shifting. No one controlled the speed anymore, and standing still in the wrong place could mean being swept away. Brotherhood no longer lived in the uniform. It now lived in a choice, to stand with the truth or to protect the structure. Julia received the message from a staffer in the police department's technical records division just after 10 p.m. The man didn't leave a name, just an anonymous message to Elijah's legal team's inbox. 3 of Mercer's files, cases 14B, 21A, and 33M, have just vanished from the main system. They're no longer in the internal access folder, and the automatic backups have been reset, but I saved local copies last week. I can send them if you want. Julia read the message twice, then again before immediately calling Trevor. They met at a cafe that had closed early, the only light a dim yellow glow over the counter. Not many words were needed. Just one line was enough to make both understand someone's wiping their footprints, and they know they left blood behind. The police department's data system isn't prone to error. All operational records are encrypted and stored in tiers. Primary system, buffer copy, and a backup server governed by technician-level access. For a set of files to disappear from all 3 tiers is not an accident. It is a deliberate act requiring administrative-level access. Julia confirmed this when she requested metadata cross-verification. The deletion timestamps aligned perfectly, between 2:17 and 2:19 a.m., just hours after the hearing had made part of the Darya Sills recordings public. Coincidence? No, it was intentional, and it was rushed. Meanwhile, in the administrative wing, a technician reported interface errors. Some internal review triggers are temporarily unreachable. The report was dismissed under the excuse of indexing system upgrade, but Julia had worked with a federal audit task force before, and she knew exactly what that meant. When someone blames indexing just after a 2 a.m. data retrieval, it's not tech, it's strategy. Trevor suggested reviewing the local copies. When he opened the first file, case 14B, it read like a ghost version of a file the system wanted erased. Testimony oddly repetitive, signatures nearly duplicated, and arrest descriptions that matched another case word for word. One scribbled note stood out, partially scratched out, then overwritten. Subject did not resist, but gaze was suspicious, sufficient grounds for Trevor froze. He had heard that phrase before, and not just once. Julia stared at the screen and said slowly, "This isn't about Mercer anymore. This is about who's trying to rewrite an entire era of this system, and whether we're holding the last original left." The missing files weren't just data. They were living proof of how arrests had been legalized through recycled language, familiar signatures, and unchecked authority. And the truth now hinged less on how many copies still existed and more on whether anyone was willing to hold them when deletion orders were coming from above. In Storage Room 4, where hard copies were still kept in parallel, someone found a cabinet drawer that had been slightly tampered with, not enough to break a lock, but just enough to see that someone had tried. No alarm was triggered, no damage reported, just a thin scratch near the lock and a few papers shuffled, as if lifted and hastily replaced. The archivist filed an internal report, but within 24 hours he was temporarily reassigned to the supply office. No one asked further. No one was allowed to mention it again. But from that day on, he kept his personal drawer locked, and during a lunch break he sent Julia one line. "I don't know how long I can keep this, but at the very least, I want to say I didn't let it all disappear." Darius Hill arrived on time, still carrying the old leather briefcase with frayed edges and the same quiet demeanor. Reserved, but not evasive. The meeting took place in the back room of Elijah's office, no larger than necessary, no bulletproof glass, no recording devices, just wooden chairs, bottled water, and a silence long enough to make small talk unnecessary. Trevor sat beside him, meeting Darius for the first time outside the context of files or case reports. When Elijah asked, not as an interrogation but more like an opening, "Where did it begin?" Darius opened his case and pulled out a yellowed sheet of paper, folded in half, with a smudged red seal in the bottom corner. At the top it read, "Temporary reassignment order, due to conduct inconsistent with operational regulations." He placed the document on the table, his finger lightly brushing the line of text, like someone tracing a familiar scar. Darius spoke without drama or embellishment. It had been a routine patrol in November, an arrest with no camera, no witnesses. The officer with him, his superior, asked him to write the statement in a way that's easier to defend. When Darius asked what that meant, the other replied, "You know, write it so no one asks any more questions." He didn't lash out, didn't slam the table or record anything. He simply said, "I'm not sure, so I won't sign." 3 days later, the incident report was filed without his input, but his name still appeared in the confirmation section. A week after that, he was summoned and accused of dishonesty by failing to report a procedural conflict. Elijah didn't interrupt, just nodded. He knew how the system rewrote motives, turning dissenters not into those who spoke up, but into those who refused to cooperate. Trevor listened in silence, but every word hit him square in the chest like a warning. He was standing exactly where Darius had stood, on the line between doing the right thing and surviving within the system. The only difference was that this time someone saw him. Darius hadn't had that. He was demoted, reassigned to administrative duties, sorting paperwork and scheduling shifts for others. No one yelled, no public accusations, just a restricted access badge, his name erased from internal rosters, and morning greetings disappearing as if he had never belonged. Darius didn't tell his story with bitterness, but when he said, "I thought not signing was the safest choice," it was Trevor who lowered his head, fingers tightening on his knees, realizing the system didn't need him to protest in order to destroy him. It only needed him not to bow at the right moment. Elijah's expression stayed calm, but when he took the old disciplinary notice from Darius, his eyes paused on the phrase, "conduct inconsistent with procedural standards," a phrase so bland it was obscene, something that could be stamped onto anyone the system wanted to blur. He didn't say much, just looked at Darius and quietly said, "We'll keep this, not to prove anything, but so someone in the future will know that refusing to fill in the blanks is also a kind of courage." Darius didn't nod, didn't smile, but as he stood and left, the shadow he left behind in that small room weighed more than any justification the system had ever used to erase those who refused to sanitize wrongdoing. No one had asked Darius to bring anything more, but as the conversation neared its end, he pulled from his inside pocket an old envelope, folded in thirds. The paper inside wasn't typed, had no logo and no reference number, just handwritten notes in blue ink, straight, neat, careful, clearly personal, not meant for any official record. "I wrote this that night," Darius said, placing it in front of Trevor. "After the team meeting, when I asked just one question, Trevor read every line, lips pressed tight. The only question written was, East Side body cam footage. Does the raw data still exist, or has it been overwritten from the server? No accusation, no names." But according to Darius, 3 days after that question, his access card was revoked, his computer locked, and his email disabled. Elijah took the note and read it slowly. He understood. The system had long used procedure as a weapon. No verdicts needed, just label someone as temporarily removed from official channels and let forgetting do the rest. Darius's question wasn't aimed at anyone, but it struck the exact blind spot everyone was trained to avoid, the source of data, where everything could be wiped, rewritten, or vanish without accountability. Julia, just returning from a meeting with the analytics unit, held the photocopy and froze. A small note in the corner read, "East Side, Night Shift 14.1, Officer in Charge, Mercer." She turned to Elijah and said firmly, "This was the arrest from 5 years ago. The original file just disappeared last week. In that yellow-lit room, 2 timestamps, one from a wiped memory, one from a missing record, aligned into a perfect cut no one could call coincidence." Trevor said nothing, but one thing had become clear. Darius didn't lose his career because of a mistake. He lost it because he asked a question no one wanted answered. And now, that very slip of paper, something he once kept as a reminder of his own failure, had become the missing piece that could surface everything buried. Elijah didn't need to convince anyone. He simply looked at Trevor and said gently, "They tried to bury him with silence. But that silence, now it's living evidence, because it can't be erased from the memory of the one who asked." Darius didn't apologize for keeping the note. He didn't explain why he hadn't shared it earlier, because those who've lived through the cost of a small question know the right moment to speak doesn't come from readiness. It comes when someone else is finally strong enough to bear the consequence. As he stood and turned to leave, Darius looked at Trevor slowly. "My question cost me everything, but you, if you dare to see it through, might make sure it wasn't meaningless." The hearing room was small, lit by stark white fluorescent tubes that made the space feel both clear and cold. There were no media cameras, no banners, no slogans, just a long table, a few hard wooden chairs, and one name printed in bold on the open file: Deputy Colin Mercer, summoned for additional questioning regarding the administrative case review. Mercer entered in full uniform, but the usual confidence in his eyes was gone. Instead, there was a subtle hesitation in the way he placed his hands on the table, touching it lightly, then pulling back, as if the wood might burn. The investigators didn't repeat old questions. They placed 3 case files on the table, 3 arrests in different districts spanning over 8 months. All bore Mercer's signature, as the officer who discovered the evidence authored the incident report and described the suspect's behavior. One investigator began, "Do you see anything unusual about these descriptions?" Mercer flipped through a few pages, then replied in the practiced tone he'd used his entire career, "No, sir. The reports reflect the actual events. I followed protocol, and the suspect's reactions required me to respond accordingly." His voice was steady, but dry. The polished tone of a decorated officer was no longer there. The committee chair slid 3 printed sheets side by side. 3 different individuals, 3 different locations, but the descriptions, the sequence of actions, and the exact phrasing of evidence discovery are identical down to the punctuation. Even the typo in non-compliant behavior, the missing accent mark in the Vietnamese phrase "found ung," appears in all 3. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Mercer blinked twice, then gave a slight nod. almost instinctively. "I might have used a template for efficiency, but the content is accurate." Another investigator cut in. "So you admit to templating testimony rather than writing specific observations?" Mercer sat upright. "No, I described what happened, but I won't deny that I may have reused sentence structures to maintain consistency." His fingers started tapping the table, not rhythmically, just sporadically, like a nervous system unsure whether to retreat or counterattack. No one pressed him, but no one moved on. The next printout was from the East Side arrest, the one whose body cam footage had been over. An investigator pointed to one line. Subject avoided eye contact, displayed performative cooperation. They asked, "How did you determine performative during an arrest?" Mercer swallowed dryly and for the first time looked directly at the speaker, but instead of answering, he simply exhaled, soft but audible, like someone realizing for the first time what it means to no longer control the narrative. The final question of the morning wasn't a legal trap, but a psychological one. "Do you think if we hadn't called you in a second time, these questions would have ever been asked?" Mercer didn't reply, but for the first time in years, his eyes wandered, not to the paperwork, but across the faces in the room, as if searching for an exit. There was none, and with every new page turned, the man who once manipulated words was now being buried beneath his own signatures. At what he thought would be the end of the session, expecting a list of follow-up items, Julie entered the room with a thin folder, stamped with an internal retrieval code from the Federal Data Relay Hub. She said nothing as she placed it on the table. One investigator read the cover page, nodded, and motioned for her to proceed. Julia opened with a scanned report from the October 14 East Side arrest, the one with the overwritten body cam footage. She pointed to the final line of the report, a handwritten edition in black ink, while the rest of the report was in blue. The note read, "Subject failed to provide alibi. Evasive behavior escalated rapidly, inconsistent language." Mercer sat silently for a few seconds, then furrowed his brow. That was an internal addition. We often annotate while finalizing reports. An investigator responded immediately. "Are you sure? Because under the current protocol, any edits after formal signing must include a digital note ID. This file has none." Mercer's eyes started to dart quickly. He leaned slightly into the chair, calculating retreat, but Julia wasn't done. She turned to the next page, a signature verification for Sergeant Loomis, who, according to the personnel record, had officially retired 1 week before the report was filed. The air in the room dropped, as if pressure had been vacuumed out. An investigator asked slowly, but with no room left to dodge, "Why does a retired officer's signature appear on a report, and why is it linked to an annotation outside the system?" Mercer didn't respond immediately. He swallowed, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned pale. His final answer sounded like someone reading the charges he once fabricated for others. "I don't remember clearly. Maybe the file wasn't finalized yet. Maybe it was a formatting error." But no one in the room heard it as an administrative mistake. Julia delivered the final line, not reading from any paper, but looking directly at Mercer. "You didn't make a mistake. You added it to cover what you couldn't erase." The statement wasn't entered into any formal charge sheet, but it hit harder than a red-stamped indictment. Mercer didn't shout, didn't deny. He just sat there, frozen, as a man realizing that the words he'd once weaponized to bury others were now the very ones pinning him down, alone, at a table no one would rise from to protect him. When asked the final question, "Would you like to invoke your right to remain silent, or shall we continue reading what you once believed was deleted?" Mercer gave no answer, but his gaze dropped, arms curling inward, breath shallow, like someone clinging to the last bit of air in a room he'd spent years sealing shut for others. That morning, a special session of the State Legislative Council was convened under a cloud of caution. On the agenda, proposal to amend arrest monitoring procedures, pursuant to the Turner case. But everyone knew it wasn't just about procedural amendments. It was the first organized declaration of war against a structure that shielded wrongdoing through paperwork. Elijah Turner walked in without an introduction. He carried no prepared speech, no thick files, just a slim folder and a gaze deep enough to command the entire room into silence. When invited to speak, he stood and spoke slowly. "I don't need to talk about my case anymore. Silence has said enough. I'm here to ask one question. What do we want to preserve in the law? The memory of a hearing, or the chance to ensure it never happens again?" He proposed a new bill, the Turner Act. Simple, concise, but sharp as a chisel against stone. First, all field camera data, body cams, and dash cams must be stored simultaneously on independent servers, uneditable. Second, all officers who file internal complaints must be reassigned to an independent task force, bypassing their former chain of command. Third, the Civilian Audit Council must review all arrests from the past 10 years that show signs of templated language, like those in Colin Mercer's reports. Elijah didn't raise his voice. Yet with each clause, the room seemed to draw back, not because he was loud, but because his quiet made it impossible to look away. The conservative bloc responded as expected. A senior legislator, seated in the front row, leaned forward, voice low but restrained. "We respect you, Mr. Turner, but if we start legislating based on emotion, every officer out there will fear putting on cuffs. Fear asking for ID." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He looked down at the table, turning an old, faded ballpoint pen between his fingers before saying, "I used to be a judge, and I was buried alive by a report, not because of emotion, but because the law protects no one when the ones writing it know how to hide behind words." The silence that followed didn't last long, but it was enough to make people glance around, uneasy. No one could deny what he said. The evidence had already aired on national television. No one could accuse him of exaggeration. He himself was the living witness to what they'd long chosen to ignore. What they feared wasn't the act. What they feared was that if the Turner Act passed, the quiet structures that had long shielded them would have to peel away, layer by layer, in the light. Elijah said nothing more. He didn't need to persuade anyone. He left the podium like he had just placed a block of stone on the table, and anyone who dared remain seated would now have to choose, either lift it with him or step aside and admit they weren't strong enough. As he walked past the rows of lawmakers, he wasn't looking for consensus. He was looking for those brave enough to understand that history isn't rewritten by speeches, it's written by the hands of those who dare to sign while everything is still trembling. As Elijah exited the chamber, he didn't see what was happening outside, but from the upper floors, media crews were pressing their cameras against the glass, filming the small square in front of the state capitol where the scattered crowd had grown. Within 2 hours of his speech, the number had risen to hundreds, then thousands. The square was filled with people holding handwritten signs. "One report almost killed a man. One law can save hundreds." And Turn Act, not just for Elijah, but for those without cameras. The hashtag Turn Act hit #1 nationwide on social media in less than a single afternoon. But what truly shook the public wasn't just the speech. It was the leaked footage from Mercer's hearing the day before, broadcast in full during prime time on CNN and MSNBC. In the footage, Mercer lowered his head, unable to explain why 3 of his reports had identical typos and descriptions copied as if from a single paragraph. No verdict was needed, just the image of someone representing the law, unable to defend the very language he had once used to convict others. That same night, lead columnists from the New York Times, The Atlantic, and The Washington Post all published editorials endorsing the Turner Act, not just as legislation, but as a self-rescue response by a system rotting from the inside. Several legislators who had remained neutral began receiving non-stop calls from their district offices. Constituents questioned them. Reporters waited at their doors. Law student groups, veterans organizations, and Black Parents Associations held urgent online forums to rally signatures for the Legislative Council. Outside the chamber, a massive banner was strung up with a simple message: "If you're still sitting, at least look out the window." And outside the window, It was no longer just the public. It was judgment, without the need for a courtroom. Inside, the debate shifted sharply. No one dared call the Turner Act emotional anymore. Now they had to choose a stance, because every word recorded, every nod or shake of the head could be tomorrow's headline. A young delegate spoke for the first time, voice not loud but firm. If this doesn't pass, then we need to say it outright. Who are we protecting, and what are we afraid of? That question needed no answer, because in that moment everyone in the chamber understood. Some questions don't belong in the minutes. They're written into history by the silence of those who can no longer deny them. Elijah sat in the hallway outside, not returning to the chamber. He looked down at the crowd below and said nothing. Julia messaged him, 3 votes short of a majority. Trevor added another. And if they don't vote, the people will replace them next time. Elijah gave a faint smile, eyes still fixed on the square. If one report almost buried me, then one line in the law will protect the next. And that sentence, nowhere in any draft, was already etched into collective memory, like a fire that began with a single sheet of paper and would not be burned again. The street Elijah walked each evening had never made him cautious. It was a short stretch between the advisory office and his rented apartment, barely 600 meters long, with 2 restaurants that closed early and a laundromat that stayed lit late into the night. He brought no escort, no vehicle, no security alerts from the internal team, just a long meeting, draining questions, and a man who once believed in the law, now walking home on heavy feet after fighting for every single vote. As he turned into a narrow alley between an old pharmacy and the back of a gas station, 3 figures stepped out nearly in unison from beside a parked car. No one shouted, no one identified themselves. One lunged first, slamming Elijah into the wall, knocking him off balance. Another came in from the side, landing a precise blow to his ribs. Elijah fought back, his field instinct still buried somewhere in his muscles, but his body no longer had the strength to counter 3 younger men. He staggered, missed a step, and his head hit the rough edge of a wall. His vision burst with streaks of blurred light. A low, flat voice spoke into his left ear. Time you learned to stay quiet. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't revenge. It was a sentence. Elijah dropped to one knee, clutching his chest, blood trailing from his forehead down the collar of his sweat-soaked white shirt. He reached for his coat pocket where his phone was, but a boot came down hard on his wrist, stopping him cold. In that flickering moment under the distant streetlight, he thought of Julia, of Trevor, of the crowd outside the state capitol, and wondered whether any of them knew that even as the law neared passage, someone had still chosen to silence him with fists and bone. A sudden engine sound echoed from the alley's mouth, not loud, but enough to freeze the 3 attackers. Headlights from a compact car lit them up, followed by a sharp brake screech and the car door swinging open. Elijah turned his head, vision swimming with blood, but he recognized the figure charging forward, fast, precise, without hesitation. A foot shot out from the narrow gap. Metal clanged and everything faded into slow magnetic darkness. He collapsed again, this time not from pain, but surrounded by rushed footsteps and a familiar voice. "It's me. Don't close your eyes." Trevor didn't plan. He only saw Elijah's body slumped in the alley, shirt bloodied, one arm curled as if still shielding himself from a blow no one should bear in old age. The closest attacker, a tall man with a wooden club, turned, but before he could strike, Trevor closed the gap, pivoted on his left foot, broke the man's grip with a sharp wrist parry, and drove him into the ground with shoulder torque. The man crumpled like a sack. The other 2 came at once, silent. But Trevor was no longer a green rookie, unsure of right and wrong. A low kick caught one in the shin, staggering him. The last one reached for Trevor's shoulder, but before he could lock his grip, Trevor reversed and pinned him with a rapid wrist hold learned from emergency intervention drills. Clean, exact, no wasted motion. In less than 2 minutes, the 3 masked men lay incapacitated, not from brutal force, but from being subdued by someone who believed in responsibility more than authority. Trevor didn't yell for help. He checked Elijah's pulse, then called 911 in a steady voice. 3 male suspects, approximately 25-30, subdued in Alley 41 behind the Milton gas station. One injured victim, serious condition, needs immediate medical attention. He held the phone to his shoulder, unbuckled his own belt, and loosely tied it around Elijah's arm to stabilize a tear. Then he turned back, scanning the attackers, all silent, all without ID. Police arrived 3 minutes later, an ambulance trailing close behind. As medics approached, an officer asked, "Did you discharge your weapon?" Trevor shook his head, raising his right hand. No shots fired, hand-to-hand only. The streetlight camera across the alley caught the whole thing. The officer paused, surprised. Trevor said nothing more, but as he glanced toward the spinning surveillance camera on the pole, he knew. Everything from the moment the headlights hit to the first strike had already been recorded. Nothing could be erased now. The next day, a trimmed clip from the traffic camera was delivered to Elijah's legal team. Julia was the first to open it. Grainy, black and white footage, but clear enough to see one man being attacked in a dark alley, another figure charging in, 3 bodies being brought down without a shout, without a single bullet fired. The final frame showed Trevor kneeling beside Elijah, hand not reaching for a weapon but extended, as if still trying to hold the truth up before it shattered one more time. That night's newscast didn't call Trevor a hero. The anchor simply said, "An attempted assault on Mr. Elijah Turner was swiftly stopped." But what was captured on camera wasn't just an intervention. It was proof that no matter where darkness chooses to strike, there are still those who bring light at the exact moment it's needed most. The hearing room that morning was unlike any previous session. No more open-ended questions, no more circular arguments, no more points needing clarification. At the center of the table lay a black hard drive, no label, no markings, but everyone in the room knew what was inside could be the lifeline or the final nail for many who had once sat in these very seats of power. Julia had brought it, along with a signed certification from the federal forensics team. All files on the drive were original, unedited, and untouched after their recorded timestamps. No one objected to opening it. No one stood to argue, because they knew if they still denied anything after today, no formal accusation would be needed, just a copy of one video, and their lives would be rewritten. The first file was an audio recording from an internal meeting in February last year. A man's voice, calm, rapid, like ticking off a checklist. If a statement leaks, make it unverifiable. The cameras protect our own. Don't expect anyone to double-check those things. The speaker remained unnamed, but the file's metadata was clear. The recording device was registered to Lieutenant Ramirez, now serving as a state-level tactical advisor. The room went silent. Someone coughed in the far right corner. No one asked anything. No one rebutted. Because that clip wasn't meant to persuade. It was meant to end denial. Next came the system access log from May, the time when 3 Mercer files vanished from the data center. The log clearly listed the user, the timestamp, and most crucially, the authentication code tied to an executive approval account, fixed to the internal operations team. No names. But when Julia projected the command hierarchy chart, the man in the center seat straightened. His face flushed red, then looked down and turned a page that didn't need turning. No one said his name, but that single act confirmed everything. People don't bow their heads over a technical error. They only do it when they know every excuse is already too late. A surveillance video from 2020 was played, a conference room, a whiteboard, and a man in plain clothes lecturing a group of young officers. A broken narrative is what kills our people. Don't let that happen. If a detail's missing, create a small one. As long as it's in the right language, the report will shield you like armor. His face unclear, but the board reflected the name of the speaker, SGT. Loomis, Behavioral Analysis Unit, retired now, but his name appears on 17 controversial reports. The hearing officer asked, "Who confirms their presence in this session?" No one answered, but no answer was needed. The date, the time, the footage, and more importantly, The unmistakable voice that once lived as rumor had now spoken in irrefutable sound. Elijah didn't sit near the table. He chose a seat near the emergency exit where the light was dim. He didn't speak. No need to revisit old wounds. He didn't look anyone in the eye, but when a 6 audio file played, with the voice of a commander who had dismissed his complaint 5 years earlier, he nodded slowly, not in agreement, but as if to mark every piece had fallen into place. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to negotiate, only the truth and the consequences. When the final slide appeared, the room tightened like a pane of reinforced glass pushed to its limit. On screen was a list of 19 names. No aliases, no abbreviations, full names, current positions, and timestamps corresponding to access logs, meetings, and report confirmations. It wasn't a charge sheet, just an administrative list, but no one in the room misunderstood what was happening, because at that moment, everyone realized there was nowhere left to hide. The first name, Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Reynolds, once hailed by state media as the face of reform, still served as a special advisor to the Office of Internal Affairs. He sat in the middle row, blue tie, pen still in hand. When his name appeared, he didn't react, but at the second line, quoting his own words from an audio file, "Don't worry about gaps in the statement, we've got synced reports to cover the unit," he lowered his head. Someone beside him reached out to offer water, but he gently pushed it away. No words, no rebuttal, and for the first time, he appeared without anything left to defend. The second name was Sergeant Lavelle Grant, former tactical team lead at the Forensic Technical Department. In over 11 controversial reports signed by her, the language was nearly identical, phrase for phrase. Subject exhibited uncooperative behavior, origin of evidence unverified, inconsistent communication tone. When the summary appeared, Lavelle stood to speak, but the hearing chair raised a hand calmly. At this point, any statements may be entered as testimony. She sat back down. Her face went pale. No one had to stop her. The truth had already done it. Another name, absent from the room, but clearly displayed on screen. Sergeant Henry Loomis, who retired with honors 2 years prior. Of the 18 Mercer case files under review, 15 bore his final sign-off. And in one audio recording he said, "We confirm what needs confirming, not what's true." No one knew where he was now, but just minutes after the clip played, an anonymous statement from his family was sent to the press. "Mr. Loomis will cooperate with investigators if summoned." No apology, no counterstatement, just an acknowledgement through silence. The last to stand was Colonel Loudon, who had once overseen internal hearing procedures. When the slide froze on his name, accompanied by the command line confirming a nighttime deletion of records, he simply stood, looked at no one, pulled out his phone and walked out. No one stopped him. They didn't need to, because that exit wasn't an escape. It was the clearest confirmation yet. No one was staying to justify anything. In a room that had hosted hundreds of defenses, this was the first time only data spoke, and data doesn't lie. A few minutes later, a representative from the Department of Justice took the floor. "Based on the evidence from the hard drive and supporting documentation, our office will initiate a federal criminal investigation into the involved individuals under Article 18.3 of the Federal Criminal Code regarding abuse of authority, obstruction of investigation, and tampering with evidence." No objections, no requests to speak. No one rose to deny it. Elijah, from the last row, simply stood and exited the room before the session ended. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He hadn't come to hear judgment. He came to confirm one thing. When truth arrives through living facts, those who live by lies are always the first to run out of words. The state legislature lit up early that day. Local television stations had set up 4 cameras at different corners of the chamber, while office staff moved briskly with thick files, their tense faces betraying a shared awareness something was about to happen, though no one dared to say it aloud. On the main table at the front lay a printed copy of the Turner Act, the sweeping reform bill aimed at overhauling law enforcement oversight and conduct across the state. 72 provisions, 148 pages, reviewed, debated, and contested over 6 long weeks. Today was decision day. Pass or reject. Neither side, supporters nor opponents, had new arguments left. The recent hearings had exposed everything, from staged incidents to deleted data to a list of 19 individuals recommended for investigation. It was all verified, all public. But truth in a legislative chamber is not always the first thing on the table. A veteran legislator stood up, his voice calm but clear. I don't deny that the Elijah Turner case was wrong, but to pass a bill of this scale over a single incident, that's reckless. Another chimed in, if we tighten oversight too much, the force will feel abandoned. What happens when they start losing morale? Julia sat in the guest row, her gaze steady. Trevor, beside her, clenched his hands, biting his lip until it bled. Elijah wasn't there. He said he didn't need to hear again what he'd been hearing his whole life. Inside the chamber, the session coordinator began roll call. The vote lights on the board lit up one by one. Yes, no votes, 35. No, 35. 3 votes left, and everyone knew if even one of them voted no, the bill would fail. The chamber grew still. No one moved. But everyone knew where the focus had shifted. The 3 remaining legislators, each seated in a separate corner, had all avoided the media, never spoken during the debates. They hadn't opposed publicly, but never endorsed either. One of them, Elijah Marsh, the youngest member, less than a year in office, had once written in a neighborhood newsletter that the bill needed more time for consideration. The second, Lydia Chen, a data scientist turned politician, is known for her stability before change stance. The last, Raymond Calloway, once a police officer, was forced out for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. He no longer trusted the system, but wasn't sure he trusted those trying to reform it either. An opponent tried to delay the vote by proposing to split the bill into 3 separate parts and pass them individually. The coordinator rejected the motion. Time was up. A journalist in the hallway spoke on live stream. Inside, the atmosphere is frozen. They don't need more data. They need courage. Trevor lowered his head, whispering as if to himself, don't let them do the right thing and then back out, because they're scared. Julia said nothing. She just kept her eyes on the screen, where the last 3 vote slots still blinked gray. The coordinator read aloud one final time. Turner Act, comprehensive version, expands internal file access, protects whistleblowers, increases public oversight, mandates training on implicit bias and conflict resolution. Current vote count, 35 in favor, 35 opposed, 3 unrecorded. A second later, Elijah Marsh stood. He didn't speak, just pulled a card from his jacket and walked to the voting console. The blinking light turned green. The chamber stayed silent. No one clapped. Not while 2 votes remain. The coordinator continued. 2 delegates remaining. At that moment, no one looked to the stage. All eyes turned toward Lydia Chen and Raymond Calloway. One looked down, one stared out the window, and both remained silent. Lydia Chen still hadn't moved. On the large screen behind her, the words "Vote Not Recorded" blinked beside her name, like an ellipsis, stretched endlessly. The session coordinator didn't prompt her or call her name. He knew any nudge at this moment could become an excuse for delay. Lydia sat with her arms folded across her chest, eyes fixed on a strip of ceiling. Her phone lit up on the table, a message from her sister, a schoolteacher in the neighboring district. The kids in my class asked about Elijah this morning. I didn't know what to tell them. Lydia exhaled softly. No one noticed. But after a few seconds, she stood, said nothing, and walked to the electronic panel, pulling her card from her pocket and sliding it into the reader. Vote number 37 lit up green. Still, no one clapped. But the quiet scrape of shifting chairs echoed like a collective breath released, and also like a warning. Only one person left, and the entire system was tipping. Raymond Calloway remained still. One hand rested on his knee, the other gripping the edge of the desk. Once a police lieutenant, he'd been out of the force for nearly 10 years. He had once believed in rules, in the organization, in what they called the mission to protect the community. But back in a 2013 hearing, he was stripped of command simply for asking, Why are we keeping someone who everyone knows falsified reports? That question was never answered. Only a reassignment out of patrol, followed by a chain of silent warnings that eventually pushed him to resign. He stepped back, no lawsuit, no speech. Since then, he had never spoken in any vote tied to his old profession. But today, in front of him, stood Elijah Turner, not in flesh but in the form of all the evidence exposed, and an entire new generation watching this chamber to see if justice was still worth believing in. Raymond didn't take his eyes off the screen. It still read, "Vote not recorded." Julia's hands were clenched. Trevor barely breathed. The chamber sat frozen, as if time had stopped. Then, suddenly, Raymond stood, without turning back, without addressing anyone. He pulled his card from his inner jacket pocket and walked forward. When he slid it into the slot, a soft beep sounded, and the tally clicked. 38 yes, 35 no. No one jumped to cheer. No applause erupted. But the entire room seemed to tremble slightly, like a thin breeze had just passed through. Some bowed their heads. One person cleaned their glasses. Another folded their hands in front of them. Julia exhaled long and slow, like someone surfacing from a near drowning. Trevor leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the floor as he whispered, "It's done." In the hallway outside, where the evening sun angled in through frosted glass, Elijah stood with one arm resting on the stone railing. A staffer burst from the chamber to deliver the news, but Elijah raised his hand to stop them. He didn't need to hear it. He already knew. Not because he was certain, but because he'd come far enough to understand. If the truth had been laid bare beyond denial, then the only question left was whether anyone had the courage to stand beside it. And today, 3 people had, not because they were forced, but because they chose to. That evening, Elijah left the Capitol without attending a single press conference. Julia searched for him everywhere, but only found a small note he'd left on a seat. "I don't need to stay for the final lines. I just need to know someone picked up the story where I left it." On television, there was no tribute, no parade, just a narrow ticker at the bottom of the screen. Turner Act passed. 38 votes in favor, 35 opposed. No applause, no medals. But some nights are like that. Quiet, unwritten, without speeches. Just 3 nods and a system that must now rewrite itself from that moment forward. The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in the Grand Hall of the State Senate. The media had arrived since morning. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and high-ranking officials lined up, waiting for their turn to speak. On stage, a large gilded sign read, "Honoring Elijah Turner, a symbol of justice and courage." The event coordinator gripped the microphone, checking in repeatedly with assistants. "Where is he?" No one had an answer. The governor's office said they'd sent the invitation 3 times. The Department of Justice confirmed he received the official notice. But now, at the final moment, the seat bearing his name remained empty, and no one knew how long they should wait for a man who had never once demanded to be waited for. Meanwhile, Elijah was sitting quietly on a bench outside a small elementary school, just a 10-minute walk from the government building. He wore a gray shirt, a light jacket, and held an old, worn notebook in his hand. No cameras, no reporters. Just a young teacher, slightly puzzled at seeing him waiting in the schoolyard, assuming he was a lost parent. But when he looked up and said, "Would you allow me 5 minutes to speak with the students? I'm not here to teach. I just want to say something. I believe the world might be better off if they hear early." She nodded, still unsure, but the look in his eyes made her certain this man didn't need credentials to prove his intent was good. Elijah entered the classroom like an ordinary old man. He didn't speak of Parliament, didn't mention the Turner Act, didn't bring up the case, the fame, or the system. He looked at the rows of seated children and shared, "When I was your age, people used to call me a name I didn't like, just because my skin was different, just because my parents lived on a street with no streetlights. And from that, I learned one thing. Once someone puts a label on you, it can take a lifetime to peel it off, unless you choose not to label anyone else." The children sat silent. Some pressed their lips together. Some looked confused, not yet grasping it fully. But their eyes locked on him, direct, whole, without doubt. Elijah closed with a sentence he had carried for years. Love needs no conditions. And respect doesn't come from rank, it comes from choosing to see someone as a person first. At that same time in the State Senate hall, the coordinator stepped to the mic, glanced at the audience, and said, "We regret to shorten the program due to unforeseen circumstances." A few sighed. Some cameras are folded. Someone whispered a joke. Maybe he's accepting an award somewhere else. But no one laughed, because they all knew Elijah Turner wasn't the kind of man who shied away from recognition. He was the kind of man who'd long since walked past it without needing to look back. That evening, as Julia waited for a night bus, she received a message from a teacher. "Mr. Turner came to my class today. He didn't talk about himself, but the kids remember every word." When Trevor heard the story, he simply said, "He's not where they hang flags for him. He's where they haven't learned what a flag is yet. And that's why his words matter." Both of them understood. Elijah didn't need certificates, didn't need medals, he didn't need to have his name in any commemorative program. He just needed one thing, that somewhere, someday, a few children might pause before calling someone by the wrong name. Elijah didn't stop at just one classroom. After that day, he kept going. No schedule, no announcements, no entourage. People only knew he'd been there when teachers began whispering, "He just spoke to 4B," or "I saw him under the tree asking if my students liked being listened to." There were no lectures, no slides, just an old man with silver hair and a quiet gaze, moving from class to class as if searching for something he had lost long ago, his faith in a future not yet worn down by the system. One early weekday morning at a suburban middle school, Elijah sat with a group of 8th graders, listening as they talked about friendship drama, prejudice, social media, and the fear of being misunderstood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't correct their words. He simply asked, "If someone does something wrong, would you rather punish them or understand why they did it?" One girl stayed quiet for a while, then said, "I don't know. I just don't want to grow up to be like the adults who treated my dad." Elijah nodded. He didn't respond, because he knew sometimes the only answer worth anything isn't said aloud. It's understood in silence that listens. Once, Julia spotted him waiting outside Rosa Parks Elementary. In his hands was a paper bag filled with old children's books, spines peeling. She walked up and asked, "Why aren't you going to the honors event in Washington next week? They've hung your picture across the entire Memorial District." Elijah smiled and replied, "Hanging my face doesn't make a scared kid feel safer when they see a cop. But if these kids here learn to ask why before they judge, then I don't need anything more." She wanted to say something else, but stayed quiet, because she understood some people don't need to be remembered by name. They need to shape the kind of people who never have to fight for the right to be themselves. During recess, a 6th grade student once asked him, "Were you the one who won that trial?" Elijah looked at the boy and smiled. "No, I didn't win anything. I was just someone who didn't stay silent when I should have spoken up, and that's something anyone can do." The boy didn't respond, but that evening he went home and asked his mother, "If someone's being treated unfairly, should I say something or wait until I'm older?" The mother later recounted the story at a teacher forum, and it was noted in the records as non-academic impact, immeasurable by tests but undeniable. When Elijah left the city, no one knew exactly where he was headed. Only a single photo circulated slowly online, showing him kneeling to tie a young boy's shoelaces in a schoolyard, sunlight slanting across his shoulders, his silver hair tousled by the breeze. No caption, no hashtag, no slogan. But to the person who took the photo, a former teacher who had just left the profession, that was the reason she returned. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the clearest voice is the old man who never waited to be thanked. There are stories that don't need to end with gunfire or applause. There are people who don't need a podium or a title to become symbols. Elijah Turner is one of them, and his story, more than a series of legal or political events, is a quiet but powerful reminder. Don't rush to judge someone by their appearance, their skin color, or what you think you know. From a man framed by the very system he once helped enforce and oversee, Elijah didn't respond with anger. He didn't retaliate. He didn't rally support. He simply followed the trail, piece by piece, gathering fragments of truth that others tried to bury and assembling them into a picture society could no longer ignore. But the deeper lesson isn't in legal procedure. It's in the choice he made to speak when silence would have been safer, to stand tall when the system expected him to fold. His resistance wasn't loud, it was steady, and it was real. What Elijah teaches us isn't hatred, it's conviction. The conviction to believe that a person's worth isn't stored in files or ranks, but in how they hold on to their integrity when pressed by injustice. Elijah could have taken medals, could have had his name printed in textbooks. Instead, he chose classrooms. He chose to speak to children, to remind them quietly, don't judge before you understand. Don't dismiss someone because they don't look like you. And never confuse kindness with weakness. In a world where prejudice often hides behind polite language, standard procedures, and signatures on falsified reports, Elijah's story reminds us justice doesn't live on paper. It lives in our everyday choices. The choice to see a human as a human, not a stereotype. The choice to question what looks normal but isn't right. And most importantly, the choice not to stay silent just because it's not happening to me. We've seen a man beaten in the street, not because he resisted, but because he stayed silent with the wrong skin color. We've seen those with badges use them as shields to excuse abuse. And then we saw someone like Trevor Banks speak up, not because he wanted praise, but because he couldn't stay silent and still look himself in the mirror. That's the shift, from pain to action, from action to real change. The lesson here isn't fight everything. It's know when to stop enabling of wrong just because it feels familiar. Know when your silence is giving power to harm. And remember, sometimes one word, one nod, one vote can shift the weight of an entire system that once felt immovable. So now we ask you, have you ever been misunderstood by someone who didn't know who you were? Have you ever been dismissed or underestimated only to quietly prove them wrong? Have you ever stayed quiet because you felt too small and later thought, maybe I should have said something? If any of that resonates, this story is for you. Not to admire Elijah Turner, but to realize any of us can be Elijah if we choose to stand upright in a world that often bows down. And if you believe this message is worth spreading, share it. Share it with those who've ever felt invisible, misjudged, or afraid to speak up. Let them see themselves in these words. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about real people and the moments that begin in silence but end in transformation. Because justice isn't a slogan, it's a decision. Yours, mine, ours, every day.